Let's start by confronting a truth that most people feel, but very few are willing to articulate clearly. When they come back, it often isn't because they suddenly discovered the depth of their love for you. It's because they lost something they were unconsciously relying on: control. Control in relationships doesn't always look obvious. It's not always manipulation in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it's much quieter, much more subtle. It's the comfort of knowing you'll be there, the predictability of your attention, the emotional safety net you provide without them having to fully show up in return. Avoidant individuals, by their nature, are deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability. Real intimacy requires exposure, consistency, emotional risk, and that's exactly what they spend most of their energy trying to avoid. So instead, they form connections where they can keep one foot out the door, where they can receive care, attention, even love without surrendering control. And for a while, that works. As long as you're present, as long as you're responding, as long as you're investing. But the moment you step back, truly step back, not as a tactic, but as a shift in your energy, something changes. The dynamic they depended on begins to collapse. The emotional structure they were quietly leaning on is no longer there to support them. That's when the message comes. That's when they check in. That's when they say they've been thinking about you, and it feels meaningful. It feels like recognition, like maybe finally they see your worth. But you have to ask a deeper question. If this was about love, why did it take your absence for them to feel it? Because love, real love, moves toward connection. It doesn't wait for disconnection to create urgency. What they're responding to is not the fullness of who you are. It's the disruption of what you were providing. You were a source of emotional regulation for them, a stabilizing force. And when that disappears, they don't experience clarity. They experience loss of control. And the human mind, when it loses control, seeks to restore it as quickly as possible. So they reach out, not necessarily with bad intentions, not necessarily to deceive you, but also not from a place of grounded, mature love. They're responding to discomfort, to the unfamiliar feeling of not having access to you anymore. And here's where it becomes dangerous for you, because if you misinterpret that moment, you step right back into the same pattern. You confuse their reaction for transformation. You read their return as proof of love, when in reality, it's often proof of dependency on a dynamic that required very little from them and everything from you. Control feels like connection when you're inside it. That's why it's so hard to see clearly. But real connection doesn't depend on your absence to activate it. It doesn't disappear when things get emotionally demanding. It doesn't reappear only when the other person feels like they're losing their grip. So when they come back, you don't just ask, do they miss me? You ask, what exactly do they miss? And what have they actually changed? Because if nothing has changed, then nothing is different. And if nothing is different, then what they're reaching for isn't love. It's control. And once you understand that control dynamic, you start to see the next layer more clearly, because what really gets activated when you go silent isn't love, it's fear. Specifically, the fear they've spent most of their life trying to outrun: abandonment. This is the paradox of the avoidant mind. This is the paradox of the avoidant mind. On the surface, they appear independent, detached, even indifferent. They create space. They delay responses. They resist emotional intensity. It looks like they don't need anyone. But underneath that structure is a very different reality, one shaped by early experiences where closeness felt unsafe, inconsistent, or overwhelming. So they learned a strategy: distance equals safety. If they don't get too close, they can't be hurt too deeply. If they stay slightly disconnected, they don't have to rely on anyone. And if they don't rely on anyone, they don't risk being abandoned. But here's the contradiction. They still have the same human need for connection. They still attach. They still bond. They just manage it differently. They suppress it, intellectualize it, or keep it at arm's length. So when you were present in their life, even if they weren't fully showing up, you were fulfilling that need in a controlled way. You were there, but not demanding too much. Available, but not forcing them into vulnerability. It was a balance they could tolerate. Then something shifts. You stop reaching out. You stop filling the silence. You stop being the emotional anchor, and suddenly the distance they created no longer feels like safety. It feels like loss. That's when their internal system gets activated. Not because they've had a sudden awakening about how much they love you, but because the very thing they were trying to prevent, abandonment, now feels real. And fear doesn't think long term. Fear reacts. It says, fix this, restore this, get that person back within reach. So they reach out. They test the connection, sometimes subtly, sometimes intensely, a memory, a simple hey. It doesn't have to be profound. It just has to reopen the line. And if you respond, even with a small amount of warmth, the anxiety eases. Not because the relationship is healed, but because the threat of abandonment has been reduced. This is why their comeback can feel so convincing. There's emotion in it, there's urgency. In it, there's urgency, sometimes even vulnerability. But it's important to recognize what's driving that behavior. It's not grounded security, it's activated fear. And fear can mimic love in very persuasive ways. It can create intensity, focus, even temporary openness. But it doesn't sustain consistency, because once the fear settles, once they feel you're back within reach, their system returns to its baseline. Distance, withdrawal, emotional regulation through separation. And suddenly you're back where you started, trying to make sense of why something that felt so real didn't last. So the question you have to ask yourself in that moment is not, do they care about me? They probably do in their own way. The deeper question is, are they capable of staying present when fear is no longer driving them? Because real connection isn't built in moments of panic. It's built in moments of stability. It's built when someone chooses closeness, not because they are afraid to lose you, but because they're ready to meet you. And if their presence only shows up when your absence triggers them, then what you're seeing is an emotional availability. It's emotional reactivity. That distinction changes everything. And so because once you see it clearly, you stop romanticizing the return. You stop assigning meaning to the moment that doesn't actually exist. And you start protecting your energy from being pulled back into a cycle that was never designed to sustain you. Their silence once felt like rejection, but your silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back to them the very fear they've been avoiding all along. And their reaction to that mirror tells you more than their words ever could. Because when someone only moves towards you out of fear of losing you, they're not choosing connection. They're escaping abandonment. And when you begin to see how fear drives that return, you're ready to understand something even more subtle and far more misleading. Because what often looks like growth in that moment is not growth at all. It's emotional panic dressed up as transformation. This is where a lot of people get pulled back in. The message sounds different this time. The tone feels softer. There's a sense of urgency, maybe even a hint of vulnerability that wasn't there before. They say things they never said. They express feelings they used to avoid. And it creates a powerful impression. Maybe they've changed. But real growth is not something that appears suddenly under pressure. Growth is slow. It's deliberate. It requires self-awareness, discomfort, and consistent effort over time. It shows up in patterns, not in isolated moments. What you're witnessing instead is what happens when someone's internal system gets overwhelmed. Think about it. When an avoidant feels that loss of control, when their fear of abandonment gets triggered, their usual defenses start to crack. The distance they relied on no longer soothes them. The detachment stops working. And in that moment of emotional overload, they temporarily access parts of themselves they normally keep buried. They feel more, they say more, they reach further. But that doesn't mean they've integrated those emotions into a new way of being. It means they've been pushed outside of their usual coping strategy. And when you're outside of your coping strategy, you're not necessarily evolving, you're reacting. Emotional panic has a very specific energy. It's intense, it's immediate, and it's convincing. It creates the illusion of depth because it bypasses the walls that were previously in place. For a moment, it feels like you're finally seeing the real them. But the real test of growth is not what someone does when they're overwhelmed. It's who they are when they're calm, because panic cannot sustain change. Once the pressure subsides, once they feel like the connection is accessible again, their system naturally gravitates back to what is familiar, back to distance, back to control, back to emotional regulation through separation. And that's the cycle that confuses so many people. You experience this brief window of closeness, of honesty, of what feels like progress. And then just as quickly it fades. They pull back, the energy shifts, the connection becomes inconsistent again. And you're left trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one who opened up and the one who disappeared. But there aren't two different people. There's one person responding to two different internal states. One is driven by panic. The other is driven by conditioning. And unless that conditioning is consciously addressed through real self-work, not just emotional spikes, it doesn't change. So when they come back with intensity, with emotion, with what sounds like clarity, you have to ground yourself in a deeper understanding. You have to look beyond the moment and ask, is this sustainable? Is this consistent? Is this rooted in awareness? Or is it just a reaction to discomfort? Because it's easy to be pulled in by what feels like a breakthrough. It's much harder to step back and recognize it as a temporary collapse of their usual defenses. And that distinction matters. Because if you interpret panic as progress, you'll keep giving chances to a pattern that hasn't actually evolved. Real growth doesn't need urgency to express itself. It doesn't disappear. What does? Things stabilize. It doesn't rely on losing you to realize your value. It shows up calmly, consistently, without pressure. So when someone suddenly becomes everything you hope for, right at the moment they feel like they're losing you, don't just ask yourself how it feels. Ask yourself how long it's ever lasted. Because emotional panic can look like love in the moment, but it cannot build a life. And anything that cannot be sustained is not transformation. It's a reaction. And once you recognize the difference between panic and real growth, another pattern starts to become impossible to ignore. Because when they come back, what they're truly seeking is not responsibility, it's relief. Relief from the tension they're feeling. Relief from the uncertainty. Relief from the discomfort of not having you within reach. And this is where things get very clear, very quickly, if you're willing to look at behavior instead of words. They live in responsibility in a relationship is not abstract. It's not something you claim. It's something you demonstrate. It means showing up consistently, even when it's inconvenient. It means being emotionally available, even when it feels unfamiliar. It means acknowledging your patterns, taking ownership of the impact you've had, and actively working to change it. That's not easy work. It requires humility. It requires self-confrontation. It requires a willingness to sit in discomfort without escaping it. But relief is immediate. Relief is about reducing internal pressure as fast as possible. So when they reach out, when they reconnect, when they say just enough to reopen the door, what they're often doing is regulating themselves through you. Your presence calms them. Your response reassures them. Your availability removes the tension they were struggling to carry on their own. And the moment that tension is reduced, the urgency disappears. That's the key distinction. If someone is driven by responsibility, their behavior becomes more stable over time. Their actions align with their words. There's a sense of direction, of intention, of effort that doesn't depend on emotional spikes. But if someone is driven by relief, their behavior fluctuates. It intensifies when they feel uncomfortable, and it fades when they feel okay again. And this creates a very specific dynamic, one where you become the regulator of their emotional state without them ever becoming accountable for the relationship itself. They come to you when they feel off. They withdraw when they feel stable. And in between, you're left trying to build something with someone who is only present when they need something from you internally. Now, again, this doesn't make them a bad person. It makes them someone who hasn't developed the capacity for emotional responsibility yet. But understanding that difference is crucial because it determines how you interpret their return. When they say they miss you, what they may actually mean is, I miss how I felt when you were there. When they say they want to try again, what they may actually be seeking is, I want this discomfort to stop. And if you step back and observe the pattern, you'll notice something important. There was very little acknowledgement of what went wrong, very little ownership of their role, and even less evidence of what will be different moving forward. because responsibility requires structure. It requires clarity. It requires change that can be seen and measured over time. Relief doesn't need any of that. It just needs access. And this is where many people get trapped, because giving someone relief feels like giving them love. You respond, you engage, you reopen yourself, and for a moment, it feels right again. But over time, you start to realize that you're the only one carrying the weight of making it work. You're the one adapting, understanding, waiting, hoping that this time will be different, while they're simply returning to you as a way to feel better. So the real question you have to ask is not whether they came back. The real question is, what did they come back prepared to take responsibility for? Not what they said, not what they felt in the moment, but what they are consistently willing to do. Because love, real love, is not just about connection, it's about accountability. It's about showing up in a way that creates safety, stability, and trust over time. And if someone is only present when they need relief, then their presence is conditional. It's tied to their internal state, not to a shared commitment. And anything that is conditional in that way cannot create something lasting. So when they come back, don't just listen for emotion, listen for ownership, look for evidence. Pay attention to whether they are stepping into responsibility or simply stepping out of discomfort. Because one builds a relationship, the other only repeats a cycle. And you cannot build something real with someone who is only there to feel better, but not to be better. And when you be egging to see that they're seeking relief more than responsibility, the pattern that follows becomes almost predictable. Because what comes next is not stability, it's a cycle. It's a cycle of temporary closeness followed by inevitable withdrawal. This is the part that feels the most confusing emotionally, because the highs can feel incredibly real. When they return, there's often a surge of connection. Conversations flow again. There's warmth, attention, even a sense of intimacy that may have been missing before. It can feel like something has finally clicked, but what you're experiencing in that moment is not a new foundation. It's a spike in emotion, a spike in availability, a spike in effort. And spikes by their nature are not sustainable. They rise quickly and they fall just as quickly. Because for an avoidant, closeness, even when they want it, comes with a cost. The more emotionally engaged they become, the more their internal system starts to register discomfort. Vulnerability increases. Expectations begin to form. The relationship starts to require consistency. And that's where the pressure builds. At first they lean in, they enjoy the connection, the familiarity, the sense of having you back. But as that closeness stabilizes, it stops being a moment and starts becoming a reality. And reality demands presence. That's when the shift happens. They begin to feel overwhelmed, not necessarily because of anything you've done, but because sustained closeness activates the very fears they've been managing all along. Fear of losing themselves, fear of being depended on, fear of not being able to meet emotional expectations. So what do? They regulate. And the way they regulate is the only way they've learned, by creating distance. The messages slow down. The energy changes. The warmth you felt just days or weeks ago begins to fade, and you find yours. Alf trying to hold on to something that felt so certain just a moment ago. This is what creates emotional whiplash. You're pulled forward by the intensity of the connection, then pushed back by the sudden withdrawal. And because the highs felt so genuine, the lows feel even more disorienting. You start asking questions. What changed? What did I do? Why does it feel like we're back at the beginning? But the truth is, you're not back at the beginning. You never actually left the pattern. The pattern is the consistency. Closeness triggers discomfort. Discomfort triggers distance. Distance creates absence. Absence triggers fear. Fear brings them back. And the cycle starts again. Now, here's the critical part. This cycle doesn't break just because the feelings are strong. It doesn't break because the connection feels meaningful. It only breaks when the underlying behavior changes. And that requires awareness, effort, and a willingness to do things differently over time. Without that, every return is just a reset of the same loop. And this is where you have to shift your focus. Because as long as you're evaluating the relationship based on how it feels in the high moments, you'll keep getting pulled back in. You'll keep hoping that this time the closeness will last. But stability is not measured in peaks. It's measured in consistency. It's measured in how someone shows up when things are calm, when there's no urgency, no fear, no emotional spike driving their behavior. Can they stay? Can they remain present without pulling away? Can they handle the normal, steady rhythm of connection without needing to escape it? If the answer is no, then the intensity you feel is not a sign of depth. It's a sign of instability. And instability, no matter how powerful it feels in the moment, cannot build something secure. So you have to stop asking whether the connection is right and start asking whether it is repeatable in a healthy way. Because anything that consistently pulls you in only to push you away is not love evolving. It's a pattern repeating. And no matter how strong the connection feels, a cycle will always take you back to the same place until you decide to step out of it. And after you have seen the cycle clearly, after you have felt the pull, the return, the withdrawal, you arrive at the most important shift of all. Because at some point, something in you begins to change. You stop reacting the same way. You stop chasing. You stop filling the silence. You start choosing yourself. And that's when their behavior often intensifies. Not because they have suddenly had a deep, life-altering realization about your value, but because your growth disrupts the role you used to play in their pattern. You were predictable before. You responded. You leaned in. You made the connection work, even when it was one-sided. In many ways, you were the stabilizing force in a dynamic that lacked real balance. But when you begin to heal, when you start setting boundaries, when your energy becomes grounded instead of reactive, you are no longer participating in that same structure. You're no longer available in the way they've come to expect. And that creates a kind of psychological friction for them because patterns rely on consistency, not healthy consistency, but familiar consistency. And the moment you step out of your role, the pattern loses its shape. Now they can't predict you. They can't rely on the same. The dynamic that once required very little from them suddenly feels uncertain. And uncertainty for someone who already struggles with emotional regulation is deeply uncomfortable. So what happens? They reach out again, sometimes more directly, sometimes more persistently. The tone may shift. The effort may increase. It might even feel for a moment like they're finally stepping up in a way you've always wanted, but you have to understand what's driving that shift. It's not necessarily clarity, it's disruption. Your absence used to trigger their fear. Now, your growth does. Because when you grow, you don't just remove your presence, you remove your participation in the old dynamic. And that forces them to confront something they've been able to avoid. The fact that the connection only worked the way it did because you were carrying it. Now, without your old responses, they fill the gap more intensely. And again, this doesn't mean their feelings are fake. It doesn't mean they don't care. What it means is that their behavior is still being driven by the loss of something familiar, not the conscious choice to build something new. Because real recognition doesn't just show up as increased effort in the moment. It shows up as sustained change. It shows up as accountability, consistency, and a willingness to meet you where you are now, not where you used to be. And this is where your clarity becomes your power. Because when you've done the work to grow, to heal, to step out of reactive patterns, you no longer measure someone by how strongly they come back. You measure them by whether they can align with the version of you that no longer tolerates inconsistency. Can they meet your boundaries? Can they respect your pace? Can they show up without pulling you back into the same emotional loop? If the answer is no, then what they're responding to is not your value. It's your unavailability, and there's a difference. One is about seeing you clearly, the other is about losing access to you. So when they reach out again, when the energy shifts, when it feels like something is changing, you don't get pulled in by the intensity of the moment. You stay anchored in what you've learned. Because say your growth was not meant to make the old dynamic work better. It was meant to free you from it. And anyone who truly values you won't just react to your absence. They will rise to meet your evolution. Anything less is not a new beginning. It's the past trying to reintroduce itself. So when you step back and look at everything we've uncovered, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Not a story built on confusion or mixed signals, but a structure, a predictable sequence of behavior that only feels complex when you're emotionally inside it. They reach out, but not from grounded love. They return, but not from real transformation. They connect, but not from true readiness. And the hardest truth to accept is this: just because something feels intense doesn't mean it's meaningful. Just because someone comes back doesn't mean they've changed. And just because there's emotion doesn't mean there's capacity. What you experienced was real, but it wasn't stable. It had depth, but not direction. And without direction, no relationship, no matter how strong it feels, can actually move forward. So the question is no longer about them, it's about you. Will you continue to interpret their fear as love? Will you keep mistaking inconsistency for complexity? Or will you finally see the pattern for what it is and choose something different? Because the moment you stop chasing clarity from someone who lives in confusion, everything shifts. You stop reacting to their timing. You stop measuring your worth through their presence. You stop reopening doors that only lead back to the same cycle. And instead, you begin to anchor yourself in something far more powerful: self-respect, emotional clarity, and standards that are no longer negotiable. Real love does not need to disappear to be felt. It does not return only when it's afraid of losing you. It does not leave you questioning where. You stand, it stays. It builds. It shows up consistently, calmly, and without conditions. So when they reach out again, and they might, you won't be moved by the message alone. You'll see the motive, you'll recognize the pattern. And most importantly, you'll understand your role in either continuing it or ending it, because at the end of the day, their return is not the opportunity. Your awareness is. And once you truly see the difference, you stop waiting for them to choose you, and you finally choose yourself.